Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight, because I love these stories. I love how they interweave. I love how the characters play such pivotal roles in just bringing the story to life. We're going to hear Courtney's side of what actually happened. Courtney. I was 16 years old when Keegan came into my life. It was the summer holidays, and I was at the shopping mall at the time, with as usual no money to my name, as my very thrifty, financially savvy mother wasn't exactly generous with my allowance, so I didn't have available funds to splash out on myself. It made me mad, because my mother was sitting on a sizable fortune, $40,000 to be exact, in a safe that she kept at the apartment. Money she'd saved up for a day when she could give up working and focus on her writing career. I had tried in vain to access that safe, in the hope I might pinch a little money for myself, without her knowing about it. But I had tried every combination I could think of, from birth dates to anniversaries, and nothing had worked. I resigned myself to the fact that I'd be pitifully poor all summer long, unlike so many of my girlfriends who had such cool parents that lavished them with generous amounts of money and gave them whopping allowances. My mother, on the other hand, thought that such parents were being ridiculous. I thought they were not. Furthermore, they took their children away on enviable holidays, while I was left feeling like the odd one out that was spending my summer holidays at home. How boring is that? I was buying an ice cream for myself at the mall and diving enthusiastically into a raspberry ripple, and that was when I spotted Keegan for the first time. I saw him standing outside the sports shop, scanning the athletic shoes on display. But everything in that designer sports shop always came with a hefty price tag, where the shoes you bought from there were a zillion times the price of regular shoes you could buy anywhere else. I always happened to notice that the people that went into that shop looked like they were rarely minted. Even the handbags they carried seemed to be lined with gold bullion, and I'm not exaggerating about that. I had been recently reading a teenage magazine, advising girls to take some initiative if they saw a boy they liked. Keegan, for me, ticked all the boxes of the kind of boy worth risking approaching, because he was absolutely gorgeous in every sense of the word. If he rejected me, what did I actually have to lose? Nothing, really. I had posters on my wall at home that reminded me of Keegan. Young teenagers like myself, on surfboards riding waves that are taller than your average house. Did I have the brazen courage to go up to a perfect stranger like this, I wondered? What I did next was the boldest, most courageous thing I've ever done in my life. I walked over to Keegan and stood beside him at the display window of the shop, pretending also to admire the shoes on offer. That was a rather pathetic excuse, I suppose, to make conversation with him, but it appeared to have worked. "Look at those boots," I pointed out. "How can they put such a hefty price tag on them? It's daylight robbery, if you ask me. My guess is you have to be a celebrity to shop in a place like this." Keegan looked up at me, flashing me a huge smile, and I melted on the spot. Close up, he was even more handsome than I had believed him to be from a distance. "I rarely like the shoes in this shop, I'm afraid. I do have very expensive taste, and an eye for quality things," he admitted. "Especially those brown boots over there. You see them, the ones with the red laces?" "Oh, yes, they're lovely. I can see why you like them. They're incredibly trendy, and I think they'd look great on you." "But you're right. You do need to make a lot of money to shop in a place like this. But I suppose I can dream. Let's just say I'm a bit skint at the moment, but not too skint to buy you another one of those ice creams you're eating. If you're interested, of course," he asked me, looking me up and down appreciatively. I knew I was looking good today, wearing my trendy jeans with their diamante decoration around the waist and pockets, and a pretty top that exposed a very lean midriff. "I would be mad to turn down an ice cream with you," I chuckled. "My name's Courtney, by the way, and you are—" "My name's Keegan. Keegan Bryce. he said, giving me a wink. Without hesitation, Keegan took my hand in his, and we trundled off to the ice cream parlour to select some ice cream. I went for strawberry and chocolate with sprinkles, while Keegan chose the salted caramel. Before I knew it, I'd invited Keegan back to my mother's apartment, as with not much money at our disposal, there wasn't much to do at the mall, so hanging around there would be pretty lame. From thenceforth our romance seemed to blossom. We began to see each other regularly, so my boring summer holidays were now not looking so long-winded and so laboriously drudgerous as I had anticipated they would likely be. I was exceedingly proud of myself for having the boldness and courage to go up to Keegan at the mall, or my holidays would have been lonely indeed, with all my friends away in exotic locations. If my mother had the remotest idea that I was messing around with an 18-year-old teenager, let's just say she would do her nut, but what she didn't know would never ever hurt her. Ostensibly, if my mother was a little more generous with her money, maybe I'd be on holiday with some of those girlfriends of mine, being supervised by their parents. So if I was bringing home stray boys to the apartment that my mother wasn't remotely aware about, then as far as I was concerned, it was all her fault. I really liked Keegan an awful lot, and he was the first boy who ever told me he loved me, so that was a big deal. I considered us to be in a serious relationship, but I was soon to realize that he had no interest in me whatsoever, and that he was only using me to get into my mother's safe so that he could steal the $40,000 it contained. When I learnt that, it was a brutal, cold, hard slap to my face that made my self-esteem take a huge tumble, as if I'd fallen down a moving escalator and hit the floor with a mighty crash. As such was the humiliation and shame I experienced. It was on one assuming afternoon that Keegan rocked up at my apartment unannounced. I had seen him earlier on in the morning, but he was back again. I was rather flustered about this, as my mother was due to return home in the next couple of hours, and Keegan knew the rules, so he needed to make himself scarce before my mother returned home from New York. So what on earth was he doing here so late in the afternoon? I opened the door to Keegan rather gingerly, frowning at him. "What are you doing here?" I practically hissed. "You do realise the time? Why are you here? You were here this morning." "You don't look best pleased to see me," said Keegan, looking like an injured puppy dog that had been thrown to the curb by an obnoxious owner. I made a face. "Well, of course I'm pleased to see you, but I saw you 3 hours ago, didn't I? And your timing is really off. I may remind you that my mother will be back home in the next couple of hours or so. You're choosing to come to see me now. It's a bit late in the day, is it not? I told you, if my mother knew I was seeing you, she would throw a tantrum, let me tell you that." "But I missed you, babe, so very much," said Keegan, giving me a big sloppy kiss on the cheek. And when he said this so tenderly and looked at me through his irresistible blue eyes, I'm afraid I melted like chocolate over scoops of very cold vanilla ice cream. "You did?" I asked, my heart pounding excitedly, because in my experience Keegan was somewhat reticent about expressing his emotions towards me. So being so romantic like this was a turn-up for the books, and what girl doesn't like to be told that she's been missed? "Of course I missed you," I said, "but I did see you 3 hours ago." "Let me come in for a little bit. I promise you I'll go before your mother returns, but I just wanted to see you again. I couldn't get you off my mind." I opened the door, and Keegan entered my mother's apartment, with a sports bag slumped over his shoulders, that made me assume he'd gone to the gym. He took me into his arms lovingly, and gave me a big, bare, affectionate hug. And then he told me he had a surprise for me, and I was to close my eyes because he was going to blindfold me for a brief moment. I giggled in surprise. "You've got a surprise for me? That's so cool! What is it?" I grinned, feeling suddenly terribly enthusiastic that Keegan had obviously brought me a gift of some kind. He must really, really like me in the circumstances, I thought. "It's a very nice surprise, Courtney. You're going to absolutely love it. But first I have to blindfold you so you don't see it, because I don't want to spoil the surprise. I want to see your reaction when you see what I've planned for you." I allowed Keegan to put a scarf around my eyes, so I couldn't see a single thing, I felt exhilarated, as being blindfolded was very exciting. "What are you doing exactly? What are you doing?" I chuckled, thinking he was playing some kind of kinky game with me. He led me to my bedroom blindfolded and asked me to lie back on my bed. And then, to my astonishment, he began to tie my arms to the bedposts and kept saying, "You're going to love this, babe. I'm telling you, you're going to love this." And I believed him. By this point, I was giggling like a silly schoolgirl who's got a crush on one of the male teachers. "You really are a naughty boy," I said, as he pulled the blindfold off me, and I smiled up at him as I realised my hands were both tied to the bedpost, so that if Keegan didn't untie me, I'd be trapped here, and knowing this at that time felt rather exciting. This was fun, I thought. No one had ever tied me up before, and I always thought Keegan was too soft to play games like this. He was obviously a lot more adventurous than I'd ever imagined him to be. I was seeing a passionate, rather kinky side to his character that he'd kept well concealed from me, which, although unorthodox, I was beginning to quite like. Wait until I told my friends all about this. I could almost imagine their shocked responses. "Oh my God, he tied you up! Oh, that's so cool!" I would go into detailed accounts of what Keegan had done to me, and my girlfriends would stare at me with wide, bewildered eyes, and suddenly their fancy exotic holiday would look rather dull compared to the adventurous time I'd spent with Keegan in the apartment. "So where is this surprise you're talking about, Keegan?" I asked. "What are you going to do to me now?" I teased. "Look at me. I'm helpless, completely defenseless. I'm at your mercy, Keegan," I said, making an exaggerated face. Keegan did not laugh. His eyes went all smouldery. And that was when I realised this game he'd been playing with me was not so benign after all. There was no twinkle in his eyes, and a serious look seemed to emerge across his face, rather like a dark thundercloud rolling across a perfectly blue sky, leaving you in no uncertain doubt that a storm is brewing. I knew something was certainly amiss, and I could feel it in every fibre of my being, like a muscle you've pulled very hard that begins to hurt badly. What was going on here? Something was seriously off. I could taste the nausea welling up in the back of my throat, and suddenly I felt as if I wanted to be violently sick and throw out the contents of my stomach. "I'm sorry, babe," he said. "It's been fun messing around with you. But I'm afraid I've only been using you all this time. It's nothing personal, but it was fun while it lasted, was it not?" "Is this some kind of warped sick joke, Keegan? Because if it is, I'm not laughing," I said. "Why would I joke about something like this, Courtney? I'm being deadly serious. Do you really think I'd be interested in you? You're 2 years younger than me. Personally, I prefer girls my age or a little older." "This isn't funny, Keegan. I don't know what you think you're doing," I said, rattling the bedpost frantically and trying desperately to pull my hands away from the grasp of the ties that held me firmly to the post. "What is wrong with you? Why are you doing this to me? Please take these ties off me, will you, Keegan? My hands are really beginning to hurt." "Sorry, Courtney. No can do, I'm afraid. But don't worry. When your mother gets back home, provided she does what she's told, I'm sure she will untie you when she returns from New York. Her train is due back shortly. My brother Ozzy is with her right now and has instructed her on what to do. You see, your mother's going to be a good little girl, Courtney, and behave herself. Or she might return home to find that her beloved little girl has been hurt rather badly. And she wouldn't want that, would she?" "You wouldn't hurt me, Keegan, would you? That's not like you. As far as I'm concerned, you don't have a mean bone in your body. You're a pussycat. So why are you being like this? This is so incongruous to your personality. You're not really going to hurt me, are you?" "That depends on how things pan out, how your mother behaves. If your mother tries to play hardball with Ozzy, well then I might have to be forced to engage my fists with you. But I don't think your mother is a stupid woman, Courtney. I'm sure she will happily cooperate with my brother. And if she does, and things go swimmingly well, then I won't touch a hair on your head." Keegan's cell phone rang, and he put it on loudspeaker so that I became poignantly aware that this was not a game by any manner of means.
"Keegan, it's me. Everything is sorted. Claudia is here with me now on the train. She's going to give me the number for the safe, but she wants to speak to her daughter first on this video phone, for she wants to make sure Courtney is fine. She doesn't want you to hurt her daughter. I've told her you're a very dangerous man, but as long as she does what we say, you won't touch her."
I could see my mother sitting on a seat in the train, looking at me with such a disquieted expression on her face.
"Are you all right, Courtney?" she asked. "You haven't been hurt, have you? You haven't been hurt?"
The video image was a bit blurry.
"Mum, he's tied me up. He wants to take all your money. But no, he hasn't hurt me. But he says if you don't pay up, he will. But I don't believe him. He's not like that." "I don't care about the money, sweetheart. I care about you. Now don't be scared. I'm going to give Keegan the number of the safe. And then when I get back to the apartment, everything is going to be absolutely fine. They're not going to hurt us. They just want the money. That's all they want."
What happened next went by in a whirl, much like one of those furious cyclones that are there one minute and gone the next, usually leaving behind them a trail of devastation. Keegan easily extracted the money from my mother's safe, which was on a shelf in the closet in the bedroom, and looked as intimidating to get in as a bank vault. I could see everything as the closet was opposite the bed. Keegan pulled away a pile of my mother's clothes that made the safe look inconspicuous, and when he tapped in the numbers, the safe opened easily. It looked like a lot more than $40,000 in the safe, and I was the first one to be so surprised. Where had my mother got all this money from? Had she robbed a bank or something? This was absolutely insane. Keegan looked up at me, unable to wipe away the grin that appeared on his face.
"It seems your mother, Courtney, has been rather economical with the truth," he said, letting out a shrill, very pleased whistle. "This is a hell of a lot of money."
Keegan looked incredibly excited and hurriedly began stuffing the money into the empty sports bag that he had brought along with him. Once he had achieved his goal, he leaned over, kissed me on the cheek rather tenderly and said,
"No hard feelings, babe. I still like you because you're a sweet kid. And don't worry, I wasn't ever going to hurt you. I lied about that. And believe it or not, I've thoroughly enjoyed the time we spent together. It was fun. But you are still too young for me. Let's just say, my brother's the one that has got the violent streak in him, but I'm not like him in that way. I'm sorry I had to tie you up in the way I did, but my brother insisted I did things his way. I'm going now."
And with that he sashayed out of the apartment, closing the door gently behind him, and then he was gone, and all became very silent and still. I was left feeling rather stupid, being tied to the bedpost like this. I had been so hoodwinked by Keegan. How could I ever have thought I liked him? I was angry with myself for being so deceived by Keegan and his good looks. But I knew deep down in my gut, Keegan would never have hurt me. I thought about my mother losing all the money, and it was all my fault because I couldn't keep my little trap shut. What on earth was wrong with me? Why did I have to blab to everyone about everything? A while later I could hear the door open. My mother rushed into the bedroom, and seconds later she was removing the ties from my hands, and then we embraced so happily. She held me for a long time in her arms, tears spilling down her cheeks.
"Thank God you're all right. Oh, thank God you're all right."
"Mum," I said, bursting into tears myself, "I'm so sorry about everything, and about all the money you've lost. This is all my fault. I've done this to you. I've done this to us. What was I thinking, Mum? I really like Keegan. I never told you about him, and I'm sorry about that. But all this time, he was never interested in me, Mum. It was always about your money in the safe. I shouldn't have told him about it, Mum. I'm so sorry. I really am," I said, dabbing the tears away from my cheeks.
"Don't worry about a thing, love,"
said my mother, cradling me in her arms and rocking me back and forth as if I was a baby. She hadn't done that for a very long time.
"I care about you, and that's all that matters. And I'm so glad that he didn't lay a finger on you."
"Are you going to call the police, Mum?" I asked.
No, of course not. Under no circumstances am I going to do that. The man on the train calling himself Ozzy, who is Keegan's older brother, is extremely dangerous. He's the one that demanded the number for the safe and doubtlessly engineered this whole scheme. If I went to the police, he told me he'd have some of his friends who have been in prison before try to harm us, and I absolutely believe him on that one. I gather he's been in prison for grievous bodily assault, so he can't be trusted as far as you can throw him. He's obviously not a very good person, so we cannot go to the police at all. But we need to pack up everything now and leave as quickly as we can. We're moving away.
Moving away, Mum? But why? I don't understand.
Because, sweetheart, the last thing we want is for those two men to find us. Because the money they stole from my safe was all fake. Imagine when they realize they've been duped by us. How are they going to take it? My guess is they'll be absolutely furious. Livid is closer to the word I would use. That man, Ozzy on the train, is not going to take such a revelation lying down, believe me, I know. The man has an ego on him that would make the Empire State Building look like a splotch on the landscape. He's arrogant, opinionated, and pig-headed, and my guess is he's going to come straight after us, and by then we'll be long gone, and I don't think they'll ever have a clue where to find us.
You mean to tell me you never had $40,000 at all, and the money in your safe was counterfeit all the time? But I thought it was real.
I'm not saying that, dear. The money in the safe is counterfeit, but as it happens, I do happen to own $40,000. But it's not in the safe. Follow me, said my mother, guiding me to her bedroom. It's over there, she said, pointing to the fake pot plant standing in the far corner of her bedroom, that I barely ever noticed these days. I was dumbfounded when my mother pulled the plant out of the styrofoam that the roots were suspended in, and then she began to remove wads of cash that were stashed at the very bottom of the plant and very well hidden. It was certainly a clever place to hide money, because it would be the last place you would ever consider looking. The house plant looked real. It had very glossy leaves. Now this is real money, Courtney, said my mother, happily clutching the pile of notes in her hands, and looked at me with a triumphant twinkle in her eyes. All this, Courtney, is exactly over $40,000. Isn't it a lot of money? We both laughed and laughed, for Ozzy and Keegan had been outdone. They thought they'd got away with all our money, and how wrong they were. They had only taken away a stash of fake money with them, and although it looked incredibly real, if they paid close attention to it, they would see it was nothing but a load of paper made to look like the real thing. My mother was getting cunningly smart in her old age, I had to admit. A woman determined not to draw the short end of the straw ever again, after her bad experience with her ex-boyfriend, who had done the dirty on her when he transferred her funds into his own bank account. My mother told me later that if you have a safe, and if you're robbed by thieves, they automatically assume your valuables are stored in a locked safe, and therefore saunter off happily with a stash of money with them that looks like the real thing, only to find out later that it was anything but. I had no idea where my mother had got such excellent quality counterfeit money from, but I felt so relieved that both Ozzy and Keegan had been outsmarted by us, and it felt really good to be the ones that had the last laugh. My mother had a fabulous plan about us moving away, and I was happy to oblige her requests. I didn't want to hang around in the apartment for a moment longer, once both men realized that they had been duped. There is no telling how they would react. I hoped they would just move on with their lives and put it behind them, and not give us a passing thought. I mean, you win some, don't you, and lose some. I hoped they would have that attitude, but I wasn't sure that they actually would. My mother had told me, in no uncertain terms, how arrogant and extremely opinionated Ozzy was, so I had a horrible feeling deep in my gut that he might try and come after us to extract his revenge. I was grateful we were moving away, and in these circumstances I put up no resistance. I was to learn we were moving to a cottage on the outskirts of a small rural town in Colorado, to a cottage called the Cat and Fox. The cottage was purchased by a woman called Maureen Fuller in 1952. I gather Maureen Fuller was a long-lost relative on my mother's side of the family, who had sadly died and left her property to my grandmother, who had signed over the deeds to my mother. I understood when Maureen Fuller purchased the cottage all those years ago, she wanted to give the cottage a name, but nothing ever came to mind. Shortly after she settled down in her new abode, she would find a fox would regularly visit the property. He became so tame that she would feed him regularly out of her own hand. And her cat, Pearlite, would also interact with the fox, and they would happily chase each other around the yard, like close friends. Hence the name Fox and Cat was born. I had no idea what to expect when we drove up to the twee little whitewashed cottage that had been built in the 1800s, and it had one time been a caretaker's cottage on a large estate, but since then much of the surrounding land had become the ownership of ranchers. I thought the Fox and Cat cottage on the outside looked like something out of a whimsical fairy tale, because it was so perfect. I was worried we'd drive up to a pile of rubble, or a house so desperately dilapidated it would require a ton of work to fix it up. But imagine my surprise when I realised that we were moving into a cottage that could have been written about in a children's book, because it really was that prepossessing. The Cat and Fox cottage was happily set up against an idyllic backdrop of alpine fields, where pretty wild flowers frolicked lackadaisically under the noonday sun, splashing the world in their mesmerising colours. There were sculptural mountains that seized the skyline with a grandiose regal deportment, so they were the first thing you saw when you woke up in the morning. I stared at them in wondrous awe. I noticed that they were shrouded by a burgeoning mist that made them look all the more dramatic, as if they hid within their mist a multitude of ancient secrets. There were a plethora of tall, lofty trees that spread out over large volumes of hilly and rather rocky countryside. Above our heads in the azure blue sky, the shrill calls from a couple of large birds that were soaring above our heads in circles gave me the distinctive feeling that I really was in the heart of the countryside. The double-storey, whitewashed, cheery cottage, with its sash windows and wrap-around porch, overlooked a rancher's beautiful field, richly dappled with green grass, where behind a wooden pole fence, black and bay horses were grazing to their heart's content. A couple of curious horses eagerly trotted over to the fence to greet us both upon our arrival, almost as if we were old, much-beloved friends. My mother parked her SUV on a neat red brick driveway. She turned around and looked at me, with a big smile developing on her face, that made her eyes appear to crinkle, so that I could see the beginning of fine lines developing. Had my poor mother aged overnight, after the stress I had put her through, I should never have opened my mouth to Keegan. What on earth was I thinking? I knew I needed to put the past behind me. This cottage was the spark of a new beginning for the both of us. "Goodness gracious me," said my mother. "I didn't expect this. I don't know about you, Courtney. I was preparing myself for the very worst. But this cottage is utterly charming, and with it overlooking a rancher's field, you could be forgiven for believing all this land is ours, without any of the demanding responsibility and upkeep it obviously entails. I can only hope the Fox and Cat cottage on the inside will be as good as on the outside. The estate agent told me we'd find the key under the doormat." For a moment I was so lost for words, as if the cat had actually caught my tongue. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "Really beautiful, Mum. Like you, I'm very surprised. I also wasn't expecting this, and I absolutely love American quarter horses, and there's so many in that field." "I know you love horses, love. Maybe if you speak to the rancher very nicely, he might let you ride one of them. I don't see why not. I've got a feeling people in these parts are very friendly. I think we're going to enjoy living here." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as my mother gingerly opened the front door. Would we be hit by a pile of dust and a damp cloying smell? Or would we be welcomed to a hoarder's paradise with stacks of magazines and an old woman's possessions tied up in piles of plastic bags that would need to be ruthlessly discarded? The heavily built wooden front door barely even creaked when we opened it. It had been exceptionally well oiled. On the inside, the sumptuously cosy cottage was pretty close to perfect, although I will admit a thin veil of dust peppered some of the classical, timeless furnishings, probably because I imagine no one had been in the cottage for a very long time.
The place was beautifully presented and very tidy. Whoever Maureen was, she was clearly extremely house-proud and had oodles of taste in regards to her style, which was certainly in keeping with the age of the cottage. But the best thing about this place was the warmth it generated, as the cottage had wide open stone fireplaces, beautiful doors that led into different rooms, and the rooms were all generously sized, and a very large kitchen that looked as if it had been remodelled in the last 10 years or so, with a very striking red range oven, polished black countertops made of granite, and a large walnut kitchen table that could easily seat over 10 people. In the far corner of the kitchen, one wall was completely devoted to the most magnificent walnut dresser that I have ever beheld. It was showing off a vast collection of the finest Wedgwood china that must have taken Maureen Fuller over a lifetime to collect. Me and my mother settled down to living in the Fox and Cat cottage extremely happily, and to our surprise there wasn't much to do to the place, beyond giving the cottage a good airing and dusting, of course. We also had to pack away some of Maureen's clothes that we found in the wardrobe, which we took to a local charity shop. Lo and behold, a week after we'd moved in, a very presumptuous black and white cat sauntered into the cottage, rubbing his head affectionately against my legs, almost as if he'd known me all his life. He began to purr furiously, and then invited himself to move in with us. I have no idea where this cat came from, but he was domesticated and very tame, with an extremely affectionate nature. We called him Wilbur. I soon became very attached to the cat. Me and my mother made friends very quickly in the small town. When people heard we'd moved into the Cat and Fox, they dropped around to see us, welcoming us with delicious dishes, like cheesy grits, cornbread, meaty casseroles and cherry pies. My mother worked hard during the day with the story she was writing, and people in town seemed pleased to learn that she was focusing on becoming an author. I eagerly explored the area around the property at leisure, and began to appreciate the exquisite scenery. At 16 years old, you'd think I'd missed the malls and the boutiques sporting designer clothes back home, but much to my surprise I did not. I had no idea that within me was a big passion for nature that was now being realized for the very first time in my life. Our immediate next-door neighbour, to the right of us, was a rancher, a man called Ed Warrenetta. He came to visit us, bringing us some of his wife's pickles, preserves and wild honey for us to enjoy, which was very good of his wife, who I understand was a flamboyant woman called Lynn, who would soon become one of my mother's very best friends. Ed Warrenetta was a very easy-going man. He assured me I was welcome to walk through the woods on his property any time I chose, and I could also ride any one of his horses if I so wished. I told him I'd taken riding lessons as a kid and knew how to ride.
Well, there you go then. I always say that it's like riding a bicycle, riding a horse. Once you've ridden a horse, you never forget how to do it. You'll be doing me a favour anyway if you ride one of the horses. I think Pie Crust will suit you fine. He's a very easy-going character.
Thank you so much, Mr. Warrenetta. I'm going to take you up on your offer.
Call me Ed, he insisted. Just pop around to the stables any time you like. You can climb under the fence if you like to take a shortcut through the fields. Tell my groom Philip that I sent you. He'll saddle you up and get Pie Crust ready for you to take out on a ride.
You have no idea what this means to me, Ed.
Oh, I think I do, Courtney. I may look like I've never been young before, but I was your age once, so I get why you love horses so much. I was passionate about them when I was your age, and I hasten to say, he chuckled, I still am. No matter how old you get, Courtney, some passions never abandon you.
Thanks to Ed Warrenetta's kindness, I would regularly ride one of his American quarter horses called Pie Crust around his extensive property. Ed made it seem like I was actually doing him a favour, when in reality it was the other way round. It was an absolute privilege to ride such a docile, easy-going and relaxed horse like Pie Crust. It would seem every time I went riding into the woods, down the pretty country trails, bespeckled with fallen leaves and twigs, under the large canopy of the tall, shady, lofty trees that weaved their branches together from a great height. Some of the trees in the woodgrove were ancient, boasting massively hefty tree trunks, formidable branches, and plenty of leafy green foliage. When I began to ride pie crust down those trails, I would always have a profound instinctive sense that I was not alone, that something was watching me. I assured myself that such ambiguous, dark thoughts were unfounded. Nobody was there. Of course they weren't. Perhaps after being tied up by Keegan, after that rather bitter experience, I was suffering from some post-traumatic stress, which was understandable in the circumstances. I was occasionally getting the jitters for no reason at all, and that was likely to happen as a side effect of that harrowing experience that had without doubt left an indelible imprint on my life, rather like a cat print that is left behind in the wet cement, and once the cement has hardened, it isn't easily wiped away. I sometimes worried that Ozzy and Keegan would find me and my mother, and there is no telling how they would react to us once they realized that we had outsmarted them. I was worried that an unsavory character like Ozzy would track us down. He had threatened my mother that if she messed him around, he'd get some of his thug-like friends to make our untimely deaths seem like an accident. By the sounds of things, Keegan's brother Ozzy had quite a monumental ego on him. Arrogant and opinionated men like Ozzy you needed to watch like a hawk, for there is no telling what men like that are capable of, and it certainly didn't help that he'd spent a stint in prison for grievous bodily assault. One day when I was riding pie crust down the country trail, the horse bolted to a sudden, immediate stop, refusing to move forwards. It was as if Pie Crust was terribly afraid that something was in our midst. "Come on, Pie Crust," I encouraged him, tapping him on the flank with the heel of my boot. "Move! Go on, move!" But Pie Crust seemed reluctant to do so, which was out of character for the very easy-going horse. That was when I observed a very obscure, indefinite figure, a dark figure, that is, emerging through the trees. I was very disquieted by this sighting, because I knew something was there, and it made me feel incredibly nervous. My mouth nearly dropped to the ground when I realized I was observing a female Bigfoot. I was so confounded by this idiosyncratic sighting that I rubbed my eyes numerous times, as if I was certain I was dreaming. Pie Crust naturally began to panic from this rather unorthodox encounter. He began to belligerently kick up his hooves, with so much dust being lifted up off the earthen trail, filtering into the air like a sandstorm. A strange whinny emerged from the back of his throat, the sound like that I've never heard before. And then the horse attempted to make these bucking movements, as if he wanted to break free from my hold and throw me off his back so he could gallop away from the Bigfoot. The Bigfoot stood there very still, and then made these strange horse-like noises through the back of her throat, and what happened next was completely bewildering. To my absolute astonishment, Pie Crust's demeanour completely shifted. The horse completely relaxed, and nonchalantly trotted over to the Bigfoot, with me still seated on her back. Pie Crust began to nuzzle the Bigfoot, as if they were the oldest of friends. I'm not sure why I didn't pull the reins in to stop Pie Crust from doing this, but it was as if I was caught up in a flow of which I had absolutely no control. The female Bigfoot began to stroke Pie Crust lovingly, and I was in no doubt she was communicating with the horse, with an enviable efficiency. The rancher Ed, who owned the stables, and who let me ride Pie Crust regularly, had actually called a horse whisperer around to his ranch recently, after purchasing a horse that failed to settle down and seemed unduly nervous all the time. This horse whisperer had worked wonders on his horse. As she told Ed, the horse was worried that she was going to be sold off yet again. But when the rancher told the horse whisperer to tell the horse that she'd be at the ranch for the rest of her life, the horse settled down to ranch life happily. It would seem the Bigfoot possessed similar abilities of telepathically being able to communicate with Pie Crust. Was I scared to be terribly close to this imposing, intimidating, lofty creature? I probably should have been, but I'm not sure if anything was circling through my mind at the time, apart from the words that this can't be happening. I have to be dreaming. It was when I realised that this was no dream, and that the Bigfoot I was seeing with my naked eyes was indeed real. And furthermore, Pie Crust really liked her, and had responded to her positively. And that is a big deal, as far as I'm concerned, because animals are very intuitive to energy fields, and can easily perceive if you mean them harm. I knew if Pie Crust trusted the Bigfoot, then so could I. I may as well not have existed as far as the Bigfoot was concerned, for she had failed to acknowledge me. I know it sounds strange, but I felt jealous that this creature's undivided attention was completely focused on Pie Crust, who was happily foraging for some leafy greens on the forest floor, and occasionally looking up lovingly at the Bigfoot through spirited brown eyes. Pie Crust appeared to have conveniently forgotten that I was actually seated on his back, and we should probably continue with our ride. I decided from my vantage point I could have a closer look at the Bigfoot, and was struck by how human she appeared to be. Her face had a human symmetry, with high cheekbones, hooded eyes, and a flat aquatic nose. Her forehead was heavily lined, but I didn't think this female Bigfoot was old at all. Her grey skin was probably weathered by the great outdoors, which would make perfect sense to me. I noticed that with the sun spilling through the canopy of the trees, the Bigfoot's dark hair in certain lights gave off a rather attractive auburn hue. She may have been about 9 foot tall, and her body Herculean in size and powerfully built. And despite her hefty proportions, she gave off a feminine energy. Around her neck she wore a leather thong of eagle's feathers. All of a sudden she looked straight up at me, and my eyes were drawn into these deep, dark chocolate pools. And I was certain in that moment she knew everything there was to know about me, almost as if she was rolling through the script of my life. I know this sounds incongruously weird, but that is what it felt like when she looked at me. That was when, to my amazement, the Bigfoot spoke to me, in a strange, rather peculiar language, and then her dark eyes became extremely sombre. All of a sudden I heard her words and their meanings in my head. Katilaki. Kotalasanitua, isilikinako, hashakasa, hompoliti, asikatilako. You're in danger. There's a black cloud coming after you. Be very careful about that. And with that she was gone from my sight. And even a week after that strange event, I would always wake up from my sleep and think, was that a dream, or did it actually happen? Let's just say when something happens to you that is so beyond the bounds of what you consider to be realistic, sometimes the easiest thing to do is to pretend it never happened at all. And that is exactly what I did, as the Bigfoot's warning words were not what I wanted to hear. So there we are, that's the end of part 3. Until next time, goodbye and good night.